Hi everyone, my name is Marcus Vaughan. I'm the co-founder of Iluminr. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to today's session on transforming risk and resilience with engagement. I'm going to introduce myself in just a few moments, but before I begin, I just want to say a massive thank you to all of you risk and resilience professionals, not only for joining today's session, but also for essentially doing what you do. I think the risk practitioners and resilience practitioners live in a pretty thankless job many times, and have a really difficult and uphill job ahead of us. And I guess one of the big questions is why is that? Why doesn't everyone just get this so quickly? But before we get into that and answer that question, I'm going to ask, I'll start this with a little bit of audience participation. I'm going to ask you two key questions to get this session started. So if you have some paper and a pen, please take them out. You're not going to be writing a major diary entry here. It's just a couple of yes/no questions. So get your pen and paper ready. Okay, first question, let's get this started. So first question is, do you believe an Australian organization is going to get hit by a ransomware attack today? So knowing what you know as a risk or resilience practitioner or professional, do you believe that an Australian organization will invariably be hit? Any organization will be hit by a ransomware attack today? Okay, that's question number one. So just a yes/no answer. That's all we're looking for at this point in time. Okay, second question. Do you believe your organization will be hit by a ransomware attack today? So have a think about that. Not any organization. Second question is about your specific organization. Will your organization be hit by a ransomware attack today? Now, if you've answered yes to the first question and no to the second question, then you're probably sitting alongside about 80% of the population who is invariably living with what we call optimism bias. Now, optimism bias is essentially a cognitive disposition that makes you believe that whilst we understand bad things are going to happen, we don't necessarily think that they're going to happen to us. So, do you believe a ransomware attack will happen to any organization? And if you've answered yes to that, I mean, you're absolutely looking at probably a whole host of data. I know the Australian Centre of Cybersecurity had over 500 reported ransomware incidents in 2021. So yes, that's very likely that that's going to happen, and you'd be right to say yes. Do you believe it will happen to you or in your organization? Now, if you answered no to that, again, you're living with an optimism bias. It will happen. Bad things are going to happen. Things like ransomware, prolific threat right now are going to happen. They're just not going to happen to us. There's a whole heap of neuroscience research that's been done on this, and I'd implore anyone to go and look at the works, in particular of Tali, Sharot, who is a UK-based neuroscientist doing a whole heap of research into cognitive biases. Worth having a look at. This is such an important factor because this becomes one of the greatest challenges that I believe risk and resilience professionals are really facing day in, day out, is how do we break down an optimism bias? How do we change people's minds from not only bad things can happen, but bad things are going to happen to us. And so that we do need to invest into mitigation strategies, and we do need to invest into preparedness, and we do need to invest into response. And so today's discussion is really focusing on engagement. How do we create that engagement really to break down that optimism bias? And why is engagement so important? Well, probably one of the greatest lessons for me, having, I guess, worked with a lot of organizations in the lead up to COVID, and then having watched them stumble through the process of responding to COVID, was whilst risk preparedness and programs and resilience programs and plans and strategies and tool sets to respond, it's all great, it's all good stuff, and I used to help a lot of clients get these strategies in place. But if you don't have engagement in your program and active engagement in your program, then I can tell you that the response is going to be really challenging. I've lived through that with a lot of our clients back in the day firsthand. And I can tell you that it all comes down to engagement. If the engagement is there, you're going to have, I guess, a lot more risk awareness. You're going to have a lot more buy-in, and you're going to have a lot more activity and involvement into and muscle memory around mitigating risk and responding accordingly. Now, if you don't have it, we've seen it firsthand. Awareness around risk declines. Capability to identify, assess, manage, respond declines. Eventually, plans and programs sit on shelves, and then essentially budgets shrink because people don't see the value, and then resources get stretched, and then impacts essentially grow because, again, that level of preparedness and mitigation has dropped. So in this presentation today, we're going to work through a whole host of key strategies and tactics that we have been deploying across organizations to lift that level of engagement. And we're seeing some quite incredible responses from those organizations dealing with that. So we're going to look at this, probably start on a one-on-one basis and some, I guess, strategies that have worked there, and then look at how do we scale that out across an organization, because we do know that obviously we don't all have access to endless resources when it comes to risk and resilience. Probably to kick things off, though, I'm just going to do a little introduction about myself because I haven't done that as yet. As I mentioned before, Marcus Vaughan. I have been in the risk and resilience industry for around 15 years now. Have lived through a whole host of lived experiences over time. To kick things off, probably this slide sums up where I grew up. So what you can see there is that red dot. I grew up in a coastal town up in Queensland called Yeppoon. Funny little town, beautiful little coastal town, 12,500 people there when I grew up, small coastal town. As you can see on the screen, though, I had to endure some interesting weather over the years. That particular image is of tropical cyclone, which is a Category 5 cyclone Marsha, which went right over Yeppoon and caused mass destruction there. I was privileged not to be there on the day. My parents were, and the eye of the storm crossed over their house. Now, that's a great example of resilience in its own right. Had that house been built before Cyclone Tracy, and had we not learned those lessons around cyclone rating structures, then their house would be flattened. But it was pretty much the only thing standing on their farm. I spent weeks after that helping them and friends essentially rebuild and clean up their properties in and around Yeppoon. Gone through a whole host of lived experiences over the years. From there, after leaving Yeppoon and going to university, did the typical Australian rite of passage through London. Unfortunately, that was at the same time as the London bombings, which is a really disorientating, piece of time in my life. Hopped off a tube, and 5 minutes later, a couple of blocks away, the tube exploded. So anyone that's been through a terrorist event will attest to the fact that it is quite an extreme impact on anyone. I was, again, lucky enough not to have a direct impact apart from just being in the city that day and trying to communicate with loved ones and colleagues and going through a situation where the whole city was locked down, which created its own learnings. From there, have gone through a whole host of experiences. Worked in a situational response team down in Melbourne during the Burke Street Mall, which a lot of people here had direct experience with as well, given the fact that the risk conference is in Melbourne today. And from there, have been assisting clients work through everything from ransomware to physical security threats through to you name it. I've been through the works with a lot of catastrophes and man-made disasters over the years. There's a whole host of learnings that come from this, and I take them with me, I guess, through every conversation I have with, whether it be executive teams or stakeholders at a management level. Probably one of the most profound experiences that I've had that's really worth sharing starts here in Christchurch. Now, it's funny, I asked an audience over in the US just last week around, hey, does anyone know where Christchurch is and what it's known for? And quite a few people have heard of Christchurch. New Zealand is on the map, which is great. Unfortunately, everyone knows Christchurch for earthquakes, as we all typically had. That all changed, as we all know, 3 years ago, where Christchurch experienced obviously a horrific mass shooting situation with the 2 mosque attacks that happened on the 15th of March in 2019. And I think about what happened that day, and I remember it vividly. I was lucky enough to be in Brisbane at the time. I was having one of those rare afternoon cafe lunches with my wife, which is very rare. For those who know me, I travel a lot. I remember picking up my phone and what was happening at that specific period of time. I'm a millennial, so I'm on my phone a lot. And Facebook was their algorithms were spinning off the Richter scale, as they had essentially grabbed what was a live stream feed of that horrific instance taking place, and then the algorithms had spun it up. So anyone on Facebook that afternoon probably saw that firsthand. I remember this because I remember dropping my phone in shock and disbelief. I remember picking up my phone. I remember telling my wife she's going to have to grab the check, and I had to get back to the office, and pretty much ran back to the office. We had a team of 5 over in Christchurch that day. So we obviously had to kick off our own critical event room, and and go into lockdown procedures, which was again a really disorientating and frightening event. They were all safe, which is fantastic. They went into motion and were assisting their clients essentially go through the procedures and processes of lockdown and shelter in place. Now, I can tell you firsthand, really, really scary afternoon. Obviously, a lot of disarray of information. No one really knew what was going on. Obviously, thankfully, he's behind bars now. The perpetrator. But what happened thereafter, I was able to spend a couple of weeks after that, spend some time in Christchurch with our team. We already had the trip booked, and it became obviously really important that we got over there after that event happened. So spent a lot of time with them, repairing and debriefing, but also with our clients and doing a lot of debriefs. And I think this is one of those moments that really hit me. We spent a lot of time with property managers in talking through what that event looked like and their level of preparedness for it, what worked, what didn't. And it's one of those things that hits you, right? Like earthquakes, they're prepared for earthquakes. Everyone knows how to get out of the building. What became really evident that day was no one knew how to go into a lockdown or a shelter-in-place procedure. And we have, you're sitting in front of a property manager or a shopping center manager, and they're welling up, recounting the situation, and just the level of disarray that they had on their hands, because they had zero capability and zero experience dealing with, because all of their focus had been on one specific threat. They didn't know how to even lock the doors so that they could work one way and not the other. They didn't know what to do if a grandma turned up at the front door and wanted to get in. No one knew. They didn't know how to communicate. Communications were a struggle that afternoon. They didn't know how to assess and escalate the situation. They were being drip fed information through from, I had one lady say that she first found out about it from her daughter, who was in school in a lockdown near the mosque. Like, that's the level of disarray. So it's one of those, it is one of those, I guess, events that happens in life, and you live through it and you get some firsthand experience from that I take with me. And I'm telling this story because storytelling is one of those underrated techniques to essentially bring to life and link facts with a narrative to influence people and change their minds about a particular risk or threat. I could stand up and throw a heap of facts and data at you about, Christchurch and probability around that event happening or not happening again, or that happening anywhere. But if you have a direct experience with something, you're able to relay and bring in the color of that. You can, start breaking down things like optimism bias. You can start creating empathy, and even release things like, oxytocin within the people that you're communicating with, which can start breaking down even the strongest mindsets of your greatest adversaries in these types of discussions. So I would always start with saying storytelling is certainly one of those tactics that is, again, underrated to be used on a one-on-one basis. Absolutely. And I always think and advocate for people to think about their lived experience and the stories that they have and how they can relay that to the audience that they're working with. Storytelling, however, will take you so far. Best used, typically on a one-on-one or one-to-many basis, of course, if you can get the platform to do so. But I think we probably also need to look at how do we start creating engagement and influence at a greater level. And scale that across the organization, because we are all accessing limited resources when it comes to risk and resilience. And one of the first things I always talk to people about around engaging the broader audience within the organization that you're dealing with is, do you know your audience? So, the first question here is, you'll see up on the screen, it's let's call that an organization, and let's say the exec team's there down in the blue. Number one, do you actually understand their objectives around what they have to achieve on an annual or a 6-monthly basis? And is your risk and resilience program aligned to those objectives? Now, it might be set in stone at a board level, and you might have some fantastic statements, but when you break that down to a function by function level, do you understand what, let's say, the head of HR or the HR director has in their balanced scorecard versus the CFO versus the head of IT, right through to customer success? What are those objectives that they're chasing down on an annual basis, and how are we aligning our risk and resilience programs to meet those objectives? And then as we start filtering down through and working with the stakeholder groups below them, how are the activities that we're undertaking also meeting their objectives? Because it's really important to have, obviously, alignment from an objectives perspective to get things started. So understanding their objectives, are the objectives of your program and your activities within that program aligned? And if they're not, I'd say that's probably a really fantastic place to start. And it's amazing when we kick off resilience programs using iluminr, just how often there is a void in the conversation when we ask around, okay, what are the objectives of this program that we're looking to achieve, and how does that align with our stakeholder group here? When we find that gap and there's a bit of silence, it's always a good point to go, okay, we probably need to do a little bit of work around understanding that, even starting to whittle that down before we get stuck right into the program. The second question I'd always ask is, do we understand their behavioral styles? So do we understand how that looks? And let's take the DISC model, for instance. Obviously the DISC model is a behavioral traits model that was built back in the 1920s. It's evolved somewhat over the years, very popular, used across, most, or not most, but a lot of organizations. And it uses 4 main traits, acknowledging that, yes, we leverage a whole host of behavioral traits, each and every person, but we might lean towards one more than the other. And the 4 key traits and questions to ask is the person that I'm engaging at the other end of this conversation, when I'm either engaging them around the resilience program, a specific activity, or even putting up a business case for more resource and risk and resilience, are they dominant? Are they big picture people, confident, blunt, outspoken? Are they an influencer? And a little bit more focused on, being energetic, very trusting, probably a little bit more collaborative and optimistic. Steadiness, they calm, deliberate dispositions. These are people that don't like to be rushed, so you might need to give them more time, right through to, or are they the conscientious person? So they, heavily focused at the data, really need to understand, the depth of the data, where it's coming from, the accuracy behind that, really big on people's expertise. So how are you approaching that conversation, and what are you bringing to the table with that? And these are people who have a fear of being wrong. So how can you approach that conversation in the most appropriate manner? Now, I'm not expecting everyone to go out and become behavioral scientists. I don't think that's a great use of your time. But what I would implore you to do, and I've used a variety of tools. I'll just put up one, which is, it's probably a bit of an overshare, but I'll give you a feel for one of the tools that I've used. So this is Crystal. Crystal's like a Chrome plugin that you can get on the internet. You get it does 10 profiles for free, and then it's obviously going to charge you money after that. But essentially what it does is it uses machine learning and AI to essentially profile against the DISC model a person's LinkedIn profile. So it takes all the data that they have on them and other data points in terms of people profiling themselves, and like you can see here, and providing some feedback on that. And so this is mine in particular. So like I said, a bit of an overshare. But funnily enough, and the reason I'm raising this is that I thought it was actually not bad. It was pretty close to the mark. So I've come out as between dominant and influencer. So yes, I am, a big picture kind of person, very enthusiastic. When communicating with me, again, get to the point quickly. If you're emailing me, make it 3 sentences or less. That is me to a T. So again, I would just implore you to have a think about, what are the tools you can access to understand your audience if you have specific meetings you need to get into, and you really need to make some change or create some influence, how you're approaching those. Do you have the right setting and the right level of data and the right communication style that's going to resonate with that person at the other end of the line. And if you don't know where they sit on the DISC model, I'd implore you, go and look them up, jump on Crystal or grab one of the other tools. I've got no affiliation with Crystal. I've just used it before and it works. Grab one of these tools and have a look at it and see, profile yourself and see if it's close to the money. I think the other key point there is also who are the influencers that can have an impact on the stakeholder or stakeholder group that you're looking to engage. So if you are not having a huge amount of success in terms of getting that engagement or that influence directly with a key stakeholder, who are the people that have their ear in the organization? Now, this is tricky to pick up on if you're new to an organization, in particular, if you're working in a hybrid or a work from home or a remote setting, it's difficult to understand that. You can get this much better if you're in the office. You'll see the hallway discussions, obviously. So, but it is important to understand what does the network look like in an organization, who relies upon who, and how can you essentially create influence, even if it's not a direct pathway to get there. This is an important one. What are the lived experiences that the people within your organization possess? And I know the risk and the resilience communities, we talk a lot about risk champions. And I always think about this, the fact that who are the people that get it? There's a lot of organizations out there that have a lot of people who have been through a lot of stuff. We've all been through COVID, so we've all got a lived experience there, which is fantastic. But I think the question mark I've got here is around overlaying things like influences within an organization. Who has had experience with a particular risk or threat that you really need to get a point across on? Because it's that lived experience that will help break down that optimism bias that might exist across the audience group that you're looking to talk to. So can you leverage someone who has a lived, a deeply impact and profound experience with particular risk or threat where they've seen it play out in real time? So it's not just a bad thing that happens, but it is a bad thing or a negative thing that's happened to them, to try and overcome that optimism bias. Use the story, link the experience to a narrative that's going to shape and influence people. If you engage enough people across the organization, you're going to find lived experiences everywhere. So I always look at that when I'm, looking to build that risk champion or resilience champion network and understanding, hey, what have you been through? What were the learnings from that? What do you think we can use from that to take away for our organization to try and build up that momentum and engagement across the organization and essentially break down that optimism bias? And then also cultural ethnicities. So I think this is still a really big opportunity that we're yet to really get our heads around and leverage. And this is where really diversity and inclusion come into play here. What are the various backgrounds across the organization? And how are we matching that with our own teams? So do we understand, the demographics of play, the cultural backgrounds, the various different heritage that we're dealing with across our organization? And then do we have the level of diversity across our own team to connect with that? We are talking about trying to engage and increase buy-in and influence with an audience. Now, how you engage one culture versus another culture, if they come from a very different background, are very different things. And if you don't understand those uniqueness, the uniqueness behind their engagement style, then you're going to need to find a way to learn that. And a big opportunity for risk practitioners, resilience practitioners, to think about how are we building our own team. From a recruitment perspective, do we know our audience? Have we engaged with HR to understand our audience better? And how can we essentially leverage that when we're recruiting our own team to make sure that we are matching the diversity in our organization with the diversity in our team? I can tell you straight up, dealing with clients from UK and Europe, right through to the US, to South America, to South Africa, all across Asia Pac, how you deal with one country versus another. And we even see major cultural differences between Australia and the US, which you don't expect to be there until you have to go and engage and create that change. It's a really big cultural divide. So, we're spending a lot of time on this, and how do we build up our team at iluminr to essentially match the audience that we have to work with, because there's a lot there that, having grown up in Queensland, and yes, I've lived in the UK, so I understand the UK to a certain extent. I spent a lot of time around the world, but how do we build up those teams that really understand the backgrounds and the depth of those unique traits, behavioral styles across the audience that we have to engage? And then also the demographics around, I guess, this influx that we have of what we call digital natives. So by 2025, 75% of the workforce is anticipated to be digital native. Now, what does that mean? That essentially means people that have grown up with the internet and take a digital first approach. I sit on the cusp of that. I'm an early 80s baby. And so, hey, I remember the A-team, but I also live on my phone, and I do take very much a digital approach to things. Now, I guess the question mark is if you're a digital immigrant, so someone who, let's say, is pre-millennial, so Gen X or earlier, do you understand the audience that you're going to have to engage with, and what are the mediums in which you're engaging them with? Are you still asking them to fill in things like Excel or even paper plans when they're very much a digital first approach? And are you leveraging things like video? So, more than 80% of the traffic on the internet these days is live feed and video. So do you understand how this audience wants to be engaged and will engage and will essentially disengage from other mediums? Do you understand what that divide is? Now, I'm not saying it all has to be tilted towards them. 25% of the workforce is still going to be digital immigrants. So it's not about forgetting about older generations, but it's about understanding and incorporating, I guess, the younger generation into the fold of your program and your engagement style. Really important from a communications perspective. I think it's important to take a moment and talk about gamification. Now, this is obviously, Dumb Ways to Die is very local, obviously, to Melbourne. This is a fantastic use case of gamification that went viral, and it's one of those opportunities, I think, that we need to think about and reflect on as risk and resilience practitioners and work out how do we essentially leverage this across what we're doing. So back in 2012, many of you probably know the story, being down in Melbourne, but Metro Trains released a public service announcement called Dumb Ways to Die. And that was two things essentially, or two primary things, which it grew and grew over time, but YouTube clip and jingle, which was very popular. And it was also had an app that you would play, a game essentially that you'd play on your phone. The results of this were absolutely outstanding in terms of a risk awareness and a safety awareness piece. So they have had more than 340 million downloads of the game. And the game's been played over 6.5 billion times. And they are able to achieve over 129 million different pledges, unique pledges to being safer around trains. Now, as we all know, Metro Trains, their remit is obviously the city limits of Melbourne. Melbourne's population's 5 million. And so to have a YouTube clip that was played over 330 million times and a game that was downloaded, more than that again, 340 million downloads for a population of 5 million suggests that they've probably exceeded what their original targets may have been. So think about the virality of that. Now, gamification, obviously there's a huge amount that goes into gamification and creating a fun experience. It also creates a dopamine hit and it essentially hits the reward function to get you to repeat the process. Now that's obviously very powerful. I think, there's a million case studies around the use of gamification. Look at how many people are now riding bikes inside their lounge rooms, just thanks to Zwift. We've got some massive companies and organizations that just live off gamification. As I understand it, and it'd be great to get someone from Metro Trains along to talk about this perhaps next time, but they saw something like a 20% drop in near misses and incidences, which was reported. And they can't put it all down to Dumb Ways to Die. I know there's a lot of strategies that would have been employed around their safety culture at that particular period of time, but certainly attribute some of that to to the gamification of dumb ways to die. So really fantastic case study. And I think it's something we need to think of. We're certainly investing a huge amount of time and resource into gamification. We see that as the future of building engagement in resilience in particular, and risk awareness. And I think it's something for you to think about and take away and go, how can we also leverage gamification in our program moving forward? I think carrot and stick is an interesting concept, and I want to talk about this a little bit more. And I know, obviously, being in the risk and the resilience profession, we have to deal with a lot of regulations, and that's obviously the backbone of having things done at a set level. I think that from my perspective, and having watched a lot of organizations be heavily regulated and 100% compliant against regulations and absolutely not be resilient. We saw that firsthand through COVID in particular. It's one of those reminders that regulation is not everything. And the stick, and I say that because I'm relating that to the stick approach in terms of hitting people over the head with what they need to get done. So I'll elaborate a little bit further here around using, I guess, the carrot versus the stick. So you can see on the screen there, we're looking at a couple of nurses washing their hands, or health practitioners, just to say washing their hands. So I guess they're nurses. The case study I'm going to refer to, it's a little bit old. So this is from, I think, 2008. There was a research study around hand washing compliance across the health industry in the US. Now, I think on average, it came out to be about 30% compliant around health practitioners essentially going through the hand washing, despite there being signs up around, hey, you must wash your hands, the soap dispensers being there, so on and so forth. Still, on average, the reporting came through at 30%. Now, one particular hospital was sought out because they had a real big issue with this in their ICU unit. Now, their compliance rate for washing their hands was 10%. Which, when you think about it, we're talking about trained health practitioners in an ICU ward, and only 10% of them are washing their hands before and after dealing with patients. So that scares me a lot. I'm going to be perfectly honest. But this study in particular, so a group of researchers in New York State essentially went and had a look at how do we essentially change the level of compliance here. What they did to start with, and again, this is a situation where all the signs were there, the training's there, you shall wash hands, and all the tools and resources are available. What they did firstly was essentially install some cameras to monitor the situation. They thought, well, that will be an added, people are being watched now. They're not being quiet about this. They've made it quite obvious that, there's recordings happening to help shape that compliance. The needle didn't move. Now, what they did to move the needle, and this is really interesting, they essentially started taking that recording. They would send it back to a team of analysts, and they did this manually. So they had monitoring situation there where the information would go back, someone's washing their hands. And then what they did was essentially have a illuminated LED board that said, great work, good job. You've just moved the compliance rate for your shift from X to Y. So let's say 30 to 40% for your shift. So great job, keep it up. Now, what they did was essentially provide an instant reward to that person, which triggers the go effect and makes them want to essentially go towards doing something again. So as opposed to using a carrot and hitting someone over the head around, you must do something, essentially rewarding them. Now, this is, they're not being rewarded financially or anything along those lines. They're essentially getting a pat on the back immediately. And that's a really important point. It was immediate feedback that came through from the research, that being really critical to help them essentially, again, trigger that go reaction in their brain. And this comes down to, again, I guess what they call the approach and avoidance behavioral traits in our brain. So if you know that there is a reward coming, that essentially does trigger a go response in your brain, where if you see that there is something that's bad or detrimental or may have an impact, it's going to essentially cause a freeze approach to it, where you will essentially avoid doing something. So by employing this approach, by incorporating immediate feedback, how it's shaping their whole team's approach to the compliance and how that's moving, and also showing the progress they were able to move the compliance rate from 10% to nearly 90% in that ward. So that is a massive move of the dial. Now, again, I'm saying this because these are things that I think we don't leverage enough in the modern risk and resilience program. And it is something that, again, I would just put to every practitioner in the room today, is have a think about how can we actually change the way that we think about risk and resilience with the stakeholders that we have to engage on an annual or a weekly basis around how do we create the go function in their brain to go towards doing more activities. Again, something we're spending a lot of time on at iluminr. Cadence of engagement. I think this is a really important point. So again, one thing that we learned through COVID and everything else that we've seen as well, all the other instances we've seen, we would always advocate for clients to go through the process of essentially running things like an annual training or an annual tabletop for their stakeholder base. The more you can get, the better. But unfortunately, most of the time, resources would only allow for an annual training and simulation effect. That leaves a really low level of cadence in terms of your engagement on resilience. So I'd say the same thing from a risk perspective. The question mark is how often are you engaging stakeholders in the risk program? Now, if it's once a year or once every 6 months, that's probably, what you see on the screen, that's probably the heartbeat of your risk and resilience program. And that can be a really tricky thing because we know that, that awareness, that buy-in is going to drop. It is essentially going to fall down the priority list only hours after you've engaged them. And so the question mark that we always raise is how do we increase that level of cadence in the program? And I know the experience that we're seeing right now. So we're doing a lot of work with our client base in terms of deploying microsimulations, which are little, bite-sized simulation activities that take 10 to 15 minutes. And we are seeing them be deployed typically on a monthly basis, some down to every 2 weeks across the stakeholder base. And we're seeing that level of engagement increase through the roof. So some organizations are seeing a 300% increase in that engagement. Now, what that's doing is getting people back into the programs on a more regular basis. So it's keeping stakeholders more risk aware around a variety of different threats throughout the year. It's making sure that they're aware of the processes they need to go through to identify and assess various different risks or threats. It's getting them to jump back into response plans and understand, right, well, how do I need to now this may have happened, this threat may have materialized. How do I mitigate the impact of that? How do I escalate that? How do I stand up a team? How do we respond? And by increasing that level of engagement from an annual or every 6 months down to a monthly and 2 weekly basis, because we are using shorter periods of time and the impost is smaller, we're seeing, just as I mentioned before, exponential growth of engagement. And so the question mark I'd again put to everyone here: how are you engaging? How often are you engaging stakeholders across the organization? And is it a regular heartbeat, or is it just that, that one blip throughout the year? If it's one blip throughout the year, then there's definitely an opportunity there to grow. And we're happy to pick up that conversation. Probably the other thing I'd also flag here, and it's common sense, but common sense isn't common, as we all know. Spending time with people outside of just, the ask. I know as risk and resilience professionals, we're typically engaging stakeholders around things we want them to do, which is typically an ask. Now, I've had the pleasure and absolute privilege of having a really deep conversation with an emergency manager over in Dallas Love Field Airport. Now, that's obviously in the heartland of Texas. Now, a year or so back, they went through what we call the deep freeze, which is essentially a severe weather system that swept right across America. Now, Texas is a very different state. It's essentially has its own electricity grid that's not connected up to the rest of the US. And a lot of their power plants, turbines just weren't weatherproof for severe winter weather. And so pretty much the whole state went into a blackout. Now, long story short, the emergency manager of Dallas Love Field Airport, a guy by the name of Benjamin Corson, really great guy, and talking with him around how he was able to keep that airport open for the 10, 11 days that that deep freeze was taking place. he put a lot of that down to the level of trust and engagement he had with the, I guess, the senior management and executive team of that organization. He was able to engage with them really early on when he saw those lead indicators of this weather event taking place, so that he could get ahead of the event before it really impacted the organization. Now, a lot of that he puts down to his 1 in 10 rule, which is for every one time that you're asking something of someone, there should be another 9 times there where you're essentially providing information or just building rapport and trust with that person. So, we're very focused on, getting things done and getting the program rolled out. That's what I do as well for a living. But I think it's really important to remember, keep that social capital going within your network, and both internally and externally, right? I mean, we're a very connected group of organizations around the world, and corporates are connected community more than ever before. So making sure that social capital is kept up in between times of when you're asking something of someone. So that really concludes, I guess, today's discussion from my perspective. Again, some key takeaways from my point of view: optimism bias is real. Understand it, be aware of it, and take the time to work on breaking it down and look at the strategies that work to break that down. Now, from my perspective, I think on a one-on-one basis, true stories and lived experiences really help do break that down. And that the art of storytelling is such a powerful way to impact a person or an audience. We are able to connect a lived experience and the facts and the learnings and the lessons that came from that with, I guess, empathy, create empathy, I should say, with what actually happened there. So that can absolutely help break down optimism bias. When you're looking to do that on scale, obviously understanding your audience is absolutely critical. Their behavioral styles, their objectives, what lived experiences sit across that audience base. How can you use that to essentially create momentum in your program? But also, what are the backgrounds, what are the cultural ethnicities that you have to deal with, and what are the demographics there at play? Are they a digital immigrant, or are they a digital native? And what are the mediums that you're using to make sure that you are connecting in this brave new world that we're working in? Gamification works. It's being deployed en masse at the moment across a whole host of different industries. I think there's a massive opportunity for the risk and resilience industry to do a lot more in this space. I'm interested to have a chat with any of you. We're obviously spending a huge amount of time on this at iluminr. We see it as really the way of the future. And with that, have a think about using the carrot as opposed to the stick when it comes to triggering a go response in someone's brain, using that approach versus avoidance approach to getting things done from a risk and resilience perspective. And finally, think about the cadence of your program. Do you have the level of cadence you require to make sure that the muscle memory is there, the capability is there across risk strategies, risk planning, but also resilience, preparation and response? These are all critical things to consider. I do apologize, obviously can't be in Melbourne. I am in isolation for COVID at the moment. If you do have any questions, though, you can relay them to our most gracious moderator today. So thank you very much. Please pass those questions across. Obviously, if you're at the conference, please do take some time, call past the iluminr booth. The guys are there. You can pick up your 10-pack of microsimulation cards. So we've created those for you to take home with you to think about deploying across your own organization. If you'd like to take the conversation offline and ask me any questions around probably the next level of depth around what was in this presentation, then please do feel free to contact me there. My contact details are on the screen, and I'd be more than happy to engage once you've had a chance to digest. Otherwise, enjoy the Risk Conference, enjoy Melbourne, and I look forward to catching up with you in due course. Thanks again.